sort of philosopher. He invented various kinds of sociological theories and so on. Enormously influential. In Germany, Haeckel. Any of you heard of Haeckel? It was the German Darwin. Tremendously influential. I think in many ways a rather malign figure, but hugely influential. But practically all of them followed the teleological view of evolution. And those who, so to speak, grasped that what Darwin might have done was to undermine the very idea of progress or design or purpose in nature. That in a way Darwin's innovation, his most radical innovation, was to remove the very idea of purpose from nature. They were frightened by it, and they spent their time looking around for a way out. Now, I'll quote someone who, although he wrote on a number of subjects, is not usually thought of as someone who comments on the philosophy of biology, namely Stalin. But Stalin said he always favored Lamarck over Darwin, he said, because Lamarck showed that we can plan the future. Remember Lamarck, the kind of vitalist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, French biologist, thought in a sense that, lots of people took this up later, George Bernard Shaw, Bergson and others, that evolution was a kind of purposive teleological process in which life, some kind of perhaps even force of life, but life pushes itself forward, invents new species, kind of becomes more and more complex, more and more highly developed and more conscious. And consciousness here is assumed to be a sign of complexity or superiority. And so what you find in the 20th century, and here I'm getting eventually, as it were, by a circuitous route to my topic tonight, are many different stratagems adopted by writers, politicians, scientists even, to avoid the genuine Darwinian vision. By the way, the latest of these devices to avoid the Darwinian vision is called the meme by Dawkins, which is the idea that there are these units of concepts. You know, I always found this a bit odd here in the kind of School of Architecture. I would say, is the Gothic a meme? Or is the medieval a meme? Is the nave of a church a meme? It's all nonsense from beginning to end, actually. I think there aren't memes. Memes are just metaphors, rather bad metaphors, for something that does exist. Genes might be fuzzy. If you talk to scientists, they say they're rather fuzzy. But there are such things as genes. There are physical structures. There aren't memes. But what memes do is they sort of introduce into culture, into human history and human affairs, the idea of evolution. And there's a sort of suggestion there, although it's never made very clear, that somehow the evolution of memes, unlike, of course, the evolution by natural selection of physical organisms, can be progressive. But of course, if you think of it, if there were memes and if they were something like genes, then it wouldn't necessarily be progressive at all. And if one thinks there are memes, or at least one entertains the fantasy, the conceit that there are memes for a moment, then I think what you'll find is that the most virulent memes are often the worst. That's to say, the memes that reproduce the fastest and last the longest are memes like racism. They never die out. They just lie sleeping somewhere like extremophiles in the depths of the earth and suddenly re-emerge again. So even if there were memes, and even if there was natural selection on memes, and by the way, there's no mechanism for the natural selection on memes, but then again, there wasn't for Darwin, before Mendel, for natural selection on species, because he didn't know anything about genes. But there are no mechanisms. I think there will be a mechanism for memes, because the whole thing is just a kind of story whereby some kind of shimmer of purpose is imposed on a process which is inherently purposeless and aimless. And one of the forms in which, I mean, more politically serious, had lots of real-world effects, in which the reaction against Darwinism was expressed, was a kind of Lamarckian politics. Now, not just in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, but the idea was that human beings, by acquiring the knowledge of evolution, by understanding what Lamarck and Darwin understood, and by building up knowledge through experimentation of how organisms developed and reproduced themselves, could in fact intervene and control or direct evolution. I found a quote here from Lysenko. We all know about Lysenko. He had these crazy ideas about developing new types of wheat and so on. But the quote that I found was actually more interesting than that. It was in a speech he gave, which Stalin was present, and the speech he said, I, Lysenko, am a manufactured human being. I was manufactured by the socialist revolution in this country. I'm not just a kind of random spawn of nature, as human beings were before this great event, before Stalin came along. I'm actually manufactured. And what we'll have in the future is all human beings will be manufactured. They'll be constructed by other human beings, like designer babies are now, as it were. They'll all be constructed by other human beings, so there won't be the kind of randomness and imperfection, if you like, that you have in actual human populations. They'll embody the human will. And I actually think that if we think of magic in a sense, and what is magic? It's kind of a tricky notion, but if we think of magic as a kind of whatever kind of practice whereby something like the human will eludes or circumvents natural law or natural chaos, kind of eludes by trickery or by force or by knowledge or by some kind of hidden esoteric or hermetic insight, can actually overcome the constraints of the world, whether those constraints be in the form of fixed laws, or whether the constraint actually be something which is even harder to get around, which is chaos, the absence of law, inherent lawlessness, even more resistant to the human will, then a kind of magical outlook on the world is one in which it's believed that somehow human beings can do that, can project their will directly into the world. Now, if you look at the history of thought, which is one of the things I've been interested in, you'll find that right through the 19th century and even now, to some extent, the idea was that magic, a magical worldview, a view of a belief in magic or a conception of the world, a magical conception of the world, was primitive. It started at the earliest phases of human development, and that as history moved along and as human beings become more like us, or like the Victorians who invented these theories, magic was left behind. And if you want to read the kind of Bible of this book, kind of interesting book though, it reads sort of very kind of oddly now, I think. There's J.G. Fraser's book, The Golden Bough. Any of you heard of that book or read that book? It's a collection. It's in print. It's still in shops. It's a big, chunky, published in 1899, 1900, I think. Big sort of chunky collection of stories and myths, legends and myths from all over the world. And he was a sort of founder, or one of the founders of cultural anthropology, although his approach, I think, is fortunately now quite dated and largely rejected, but very influential outside of anthropology, because the idea that primitive peoples, so-called traditional peoples, have a magical view of the world. That, for example, if they're asked, where is your soul? They say it's in a tree. Or if they say, well, what are you doing now? They say, well, I'm projecting my soul into another part of the world. Or if they believe if they bang drums, then it'll rain or stop raining. These are all seen as kind of forms of magical thinking, and that as human society evolves and develops, that's put on one side, and then you get science and philosophy and theory, and you get, in other words, genuine knowledge. And through genuine knowledge, human beings can dispense with magic. They don't have magical thinking. And that's the sort of argument, that's the structure of argument in Fraser's book. If you read the book, it's sort of bafflement that people could ever have been so savage as to believe all this nonsense. Now, Wittgenstein, who read the book, he was in Cambridge, I think, a rather good comment on it. He said he'd read this book, and he said, Fraser's more savage than most of these savages he writes about. He's essentially an extraordinarily primitive being, Fraser. It's almost as if, one could go and look at him. kind of examine him and think, God, this is incredible that there could be something so primitive as this, but there really is. As J.G. Fraser. But Fraser was an heir of European positivism. And if you want to know where Fraser got his ideas from, it was essentially from Comte and from Saint-Simon, the European positivists. And the European positivists saw, and again, it's been immensely influential. And one of the things about these forgotten thinkers is that although not many people nowadays ever read Comte or have even heard of them, still less Saint-Simon, their ideas have been hugely, enormously influential, almost all pervasive now. The idea is that, as it were, human culture starts with magic, gets turned into organized religions, then you get metaphysics. Then out of metaphysics you get science, and out of science you get us. And so this kind of developmental phase. And the Middle Ages were founded on religion, in this fairy tale, in a new type of society to which Comte and Saint-Simon look forward. There would be hierarchies, but they would be industrial hierarchies. There would be a view of the world, but it would be scientific. And there would also, quite interestingly, be a religion. The religion, as they called it, of humanity, in which humanity was the supreme being instead of any kind of deity of the sort that had existed in Western monotheism. By the way, this went as far, the positivist religion, that books were written about how the priests of positivism would go about their rituals and their works, and in fact positivist churches were opened in Liverpool, Manchester. George Eliot, the writer, was very keen on all this. Brazil, Vietnam. A number of the world's leading canal builders became positivists. They were like the sort of internet entrepreneurs of their day, and that sort of boosted it. The man who built the Panama Canal was a positivist. A positivist slogan is you can find on the Brazilian flag: progress through order. Sounds positively Mendelssohnian. And so the idea was you went through all these. By the way, there was also even a positivist liturgy was developed, which used the best science of the day, which was phrenology, the science of bumps on the head. And the idea was that instead of the Catholic liturgy, which you would practice every day, you would that the practicing positivist would touch the bumps on their heads, which embodied progress, wisdom, benevolence, and so on. I think they had to do it 7 times a day. And if they faithfully did it, they would gradually become more progressive, more benign, more wise, more etc. So there was even a positivist Virgin Mary, a married woman with whom the founder of positivism fell in love. It was never consummated. Sadly, she died, and therefore could be sanctified. So it all sounds sort of utterly absurd, and you would think, how could anything like this have any significant influence? But it did. It wasn't just a cult. Had an enormous influence. John Stuart Mill was very influenced by it. Marx was. George Eliot and a number of other significant Victorian writers were. But the real deposit of it is this idea of human history, the history of human thought, is moving from magic to religion to metaphysics then to science. That's absolutely, it didn't exist before in positivists. I think it's really largely their work. And practically everybody now subscribes to it in one form or another. And a lot of these rather banal debates, if you want interesting debates about religion, go back and read the Victorians. They're much more interesting than what you have now. All these rather banal and tedious debates we have now are essentially in the positivist mode. People say, well, we've got science now, well, we don't need religion. We've got these theories. And others say, well, I don't know. Of course, we don't know a lot, and there are lots of sort of gaps in the science, so we have to have God fill them in. I mean, it's all a kind of very primitive, seems to me, more primitive than the Victorians actually were. And so one of my theses, or just one of my at least kind of thoughts to put before you, is that this is a kind of very simple, crude way of thinking about things. If you want to ask where the magical impulse or the magical outlook